I wonder if you know that today is an important anniversary. It's been exactly 1 year. I think this is the end of the 1 year since we moved, because of the pandemic, to Zoom church. Just 1 year. And it's been, I think, almost as exactly 6 months since the ceiling in the worship space fell down. And we realized that we had a major repair and renovation job ahead of us before we could return to our beloved church building, regardless of what happened with the pandemic precautions. So when I realized this, it set me thinking as I was praying, as a preacher does during the week ahead of his appointment, praying with these wonderful lessons. What have we learned in this year of worshiping apart from our building? What have we learned about worship and about ourselves? What wisdom might these lessons have to give us as we think about our return to the building, so eagerly awaited? Well, one thing I suppose that we have obviously learned is that we can worship without a building. In other words, we, the people, are the church, not the building. But we have certainly also learned how important, how dear our building is to our very sense of being and to the world around us, the world of which we are a part. One of the most wonderful moments in this series of videos, which I hope you've gotten in the habit of watching, that George Schell and John Grafferer have given us of the progress of the work. One of the most wonderful moments was the interview with the young contractor who's been doing all of this work, he and his crew, Chris Wardell, when he said, "We love to work on churches because it means something to the whole community, not just like a private house." So we're reminded that not being able to be in this building somehow privatizes our worship in a way that we don't want to have happen. We're blessed with a lovely and very historic church. I did a little digging around in various sources, and it turns out that the building was begun in 1828, about 25 years after the congregation was originally founded. I guess they worshiped in another building before then. And it was consecrated in July of 1829. So it's coming up to be just about 200 years old. And for its time, this surprised me, for its time, it was a radical innovation in church building. It was apparently, the sources say, it was apparently the first stone church in New Hampshire. All earlier churches were either wood, like First Church, or built of brick, the first stone church. And it was also the first church to move away from the basic New England meeting house architecture, what we call colonial or neo-Georgian architecture, or Georgian architecture, I guess, to move away from that towards Gothic revival architecture. Think about all the pointed windows, that motif which is played out in the architecture of the building. Now, this Gothic revival began around the beginning of the 18th century in England, and it was spreading to America. It was part of a broader Romantic movement. Think William Wordsworth, an attempt to probably in reaction to the sterility of industrialization in England and the sterility of the rational Enlightenment thought of the 18th century. So an attempt to go back behind the Reformation and to medieval and ancient roots for Christianity. And this would blossom just a few years later in the 1830s into what was known and is known as the Oxford movement, the recovery of Anglicanism's broader Catholic heritage. But for all of that novelty, this new church was still a meeting house rectangular building, was one large open room, not a series of long, narrow rooms, a nave, a chancel, a sanctuary with the altar way away from the people. And it was interesting in the films of the construction, basically what appears to be the way the building was built is it's a traditional post and beam New England building with a stone shell simply built around it, not integral to it. So it's fascinating, and I would be interesting to have some real architecture historians talk to us more about what that means. Why did we do this, we Anglicans? I suspect it was partly at that time a reaction against the Puritan past. This was the time early in the 18th century where the Congregational Church was breaking apart, with some people becoming Unitarians. They were impatient with the Calvinist heritage of Congregationalism. And I expect that by adopting this sort of early creeping Gothic architecture, that the builders of our building were trying to move away from that and reclaim a deeper Anglican heritage. So it's interesting. This lovely exterior has come down to us essentially unchanged, except for the addition, apparently in the 1920s, of the graceful Gothic steeple, which really carries that Gothic revival element into completion in the building. Now, the interior of our worship space, that tells a very different story because it's undergone a variety of alterations through the years. And these too have reflected worship patterns in the Episcopal Church and changes in those patterns. Originally, the interior was apparently unpainted wood, so it was rather dark and probably rather Gothic in feel. It wasn't whitewashed Congregationalist. And the earliest photograph we have, which is in the sacristy, shows a bunch of ornate Gothic furniture up in the front around the altar in dark wood, very, very imposing, like some sort of operatic stage set in some ways. The box pews they've got a history all of their own. Up until the Reformation, most churches in Europe and England and America, well, there were none in America at that point, but most churches had no pews. People stood throughout the service, or sometimes there were stone benches for old people along the walls. And then what happened in the Reformation is that people began preaching longer sermons, and they didn't want to stand during all of the sermon. So the rich began to bring their own seating and to protect their place, and they wanted to be up front where they could hear and see well. They would put fences around that. And you can see how that becomes a box, and people would pass those boxes down to their heirs, and they would decorate them often. You can still see some churches. There's one in Newport that has elaborately decorated separate box pews. And that becomes our pews. And our pews have numbers because churches were not, until well into the 20th century, they were not supported by pledges. You rented a pew for the year, and you paid something for that rent, and each pew had a different price. Made it a little difficult for the poor, so some churches, and maybe that had to do with our balcony, I don't know, some churches had seating in the back or in the balcony on benches for those who couldn't afford to rent a pew. So those changes, until really the 1979 prayer book, the basic Sunday worship was morning prayer and sermon. And that's a wonderful and lovely form of worship, but it isn't a form in which the people move around. The people are basically an audience in rows, focused on the preacher and the choir up front. So that means that you didn't have the clumsiness of opening the doors and edging your way up the narrow aisles. And incidentally, the double aisle feature of our church is another meeting house inheritance, because it goes back to the days when women and men sat on opposite sides of the church. So no hanky-pank during those longer sermons. Now, in the 1890s, there was a further wave of Anglo-Catholicism that lapped on St. Andrew's shore, and that brought our stained glass windows with their, to me at least, rather sentimental late Victorian piety. And it's possible also, I was talking to somebody yesterday about this, it's possible that in the late 1980s, this was no longer just a country farmer's church. It was a summer colony and people who could take the train. And so it began to be a suburb of places like Concord. And it's quite possible that the congregation wanted to fancy up. And having these stained glass windows was a way to do that. And right next door to us and often intertwined, so clergy serving in both places, was St. Paul's School, which was built by Anglo-Catholics from Boston and has extremely elaborate Victorian stained glass windows. So there we are. And this Anglo-Catholicism also brought things like the Stations of the Cross and the tabernacle with the reserved sacrament behind the altar and the Sanctus lamp that hangs down. All of these things, these changes, didn't come easily. There were bitter fights in both England and America over such things as candles on the altar or colored vestments, let alone the reserved sacrament. These were signs of popery, but they came to St. Andrew's. So on the one hand, continuity, on the other hand, change. That's the way things tend to go in the Anglican tradition. There's a saying that I think it gives us a lot to think about, that tradition is the living hand of the dead, while traditionalism, that is doing things just because we always used to do them, traditionalism is the dead hand of the living. So what guides the development of tradition? What keeps our tradition living and avoids it becoming death-dealing? That's where I think the readings today give us some very helpful guidance. And the most important, of course, which echoed through the psalm and the opening hymn, is that very first commandment. All the others really are footnotes that follow on the first commandment. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So God alone is first, last, and always. And anything, the worship of anything that detracts from that primacy of the living God is idolatry. So the next commandment goes on to condemn idolatry. The test of whether a change is good or bad, then, is in the end whether it promotes the supremacy of God or whether it detracts from that supremacy and leads us into putting something else first, into idolatry, which isn't an easy test to apply, but which is essential when we work out what changes to embrace and which to put aside. Then there's the gospel reading with Jesus entering the temple in Jerusalem and driving out the animals that were sold there to be sacrificed. overturning the tables of the people who were changing money. What were they doing? Well, you had to pay to buy the animals or to pay your temple fees. You had to pay in holy temple money, not in secular Roman money, which would pollute you. So there was a lively business among the money changers, changing one coinage to another. And everybody was making some money along the sides. And it was a commercial transaction because to be saved, you had to participate in this temple life. And so you had to engage in these commercial transactions. In other words, it had become idolatry, the thing which had begun to connect people to the living God had become an end in itself, which can happen in religion. So Jesus was acting out in this gospel passage, as he does repeatedly in the Gospels, acting out his role as reformer and purifier of his religion. We always need to remember that Jesus didn't come to establish a new religion, but to reform Judaism, of which he was a part. So if we look closely, I think we can see some of this reforming energy, this working out of tradition, this weighing of what is good and what is not so good. We can see this energy working in the history of St. Andrew's building. Which brings us in closing to the third reading. The message of the cross, says St. Paul, is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. At the very tip of our steeple, apart from architecture, the very tip of the steeple is what? Yes, a cross. And before us at the altar in the church, leading us in procession when the choir and ministers enter, marked upon our foreheads at baptism, and yes, traced upon us in benediction as our bodies are returned to the ground, is what? A cross. What more powerful reminder then that the paschal mystery of death and resurrection is always at the heart of faith in the living God and is what shapes our buildings. Let us join together in confessing our faith